In 1913, the Chancellor Lloyd George took a visit to the Oxford Union Debating Society to make a speech, and he was greeted by a dead pheasant thrown at his head. And this was because Mr. Lloyd George was very good at annoying aristocrats, which is the subject of today's episode. There's going to be a lot of aristocrat bashing in the next few episodes, so I just wanted to say that not all aristocrats are bad. Many of my closest friends are aristocrats, and a lot of them abandon their landed interests and just move into massive houses in London, which is fine and sensible. But as we saw in the hunting episode, some of them stay on the land and they want control, and that was Lloyd George's problem. At the Union, he announced that between 1852 and 1911, gamekeepers had increased from 9,000 to 23,000, while in the same period farm workers had declined by 600,000, and almost half of England was being used to run shoots. This graph shows cultivations in England, and besides a little blip in the First World War, it was going downhill. People were doing less farming. And this was not helped by the aristocratic landlords, because low productivity grassland was suited to their hunting and shooting, which was what they were interested in. And they used their political influence to pass lots of oppressive game laws throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The 1862 Poaching Prevention Act gave the police stop and search powers if they suspected anybody had been illegally hunting game, which essentially made the police auxiliary gamekeepers. This meant lots of people were in prison for poaching, and the chaps behind the Anti-Corn Law League started campaigning against the game laws. The Liberal Party knew that something had to change. In 1880, they passed the Ground Game Act, which gave farmers the inalienable right to kill rabbits. But this didn't stop landlords placing restrictions on what their tenants could do. This agreement from 1891 says that an additional rent of £100 will be incurred for every acre of grassland ploughed without the landlord's permission, which in today's money works out as £10,576 per acre of land that was already being paid for through rent. Although the Liberals kept trying to pass legislation to help farmers, the House of Lords kept diluting it. So the 1906 Agricultural Holdings Act went some way to free tenants from overbearing landlords, but the Lords removed the clause allowing farmers to shoot game in crops, and they made it much harder for farmers to claim compensation for any damage caused. So enter David Lloyd George, a Welshman from an actually quite lowly background, raised by his mother and uncle, who was a shoemaker and a strong believer in liberal politics. Lloyd George was a very good speaker, so he became a lawyer and became involved in local politics and rose through the ranks until in 1908 he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Having a rural upbringing, Lloyd George consciously aligned himself with the spirit of poaching and was a formidable defender of poachers in court. He even claimed he was a poacher himself. I have not lived for 25 years in a rural area without knowing more about game than a gamekeeper would like. A man of the people, but I think this was his point. People in cities also hated landlords, which continues to this day if you go on social media. So the tyrannical laws protecting game were very easy to attack. I think Lloyd George did genuinely believe this stuff, but it was good political showmanship. Rural issues were important to the urban political landscape because if agricultural wages were low, workers would move from the countryside into the city and saturate the industrial labour market. And bashing landlords was also a very welcome political distraction from other stuff going on, like problems in Ireland. But nevertheless, there does seem to be a genuine political desire to free the countryside from mismanagement by aristocrats, who through oppressive game laws have managed to unite everybody else against them. But none of this really mattered that much because it was all overshadowed by a series of welfare reforms the Liberal government was trying to push through, which created the first British welfare state. In 1906, they instituted measures to provide free school meals. In 1908, they introduced state pensions for people over the age of 70. The National Insurance Act 1911 meant employers, the government and workers would all contribute to a form of health insurance that would also provide unemployment benefits for cyclical industries. Quite radical, really. But as we British know, there is no magic money tree, and these policies needed to be funded somehow. If only there was a wealthy minority who were very easy to villainise. So Lloyd George decided that these welfare reforms would be funded essentially by the aristocracy who would be taxed. So in 1909 he introduced what he called the People's Budget, which was quite radical because it explicitly intended to redistribute wealth more equally across the British population. Here he is with fellow reformer Winston Churchill. People earning over £2,000 a year would have to pay a higher rate of income tax, but more importantly, aristocrats would have to pay death duties on their estates, which was 20% of the unearned increase in the value of their land. Unlike the Corn Laws, this wasn't rural versus urban, this was everybody versus the aristocracy, and it was framed framed as a class conflict at the time. The Lords responded very negatively to the proposals and blocked it, which caused a constitutional crisis. So they had 2 elections in 1910 to try and fix it, and the Liberal government narrowly survived and the measures were pushed through. After that ordeal, the House of Lords was restricted in the Parliament Act 1911, so Lloyd George had levied a tax on the aristocracy, but he was also eroding their political power. This put many aristocratic families in a difficult situation because paying death duties on their estates generally meant selling part of it, and farming wasn't very profitable in this period, so many of them just gave up. The land valuation clauses of the Finance Act associated with Mr. Lloyd George alarmed the landlords as threatening the security of their possessions. This itself was said to have caused the then Duke of Bedford to sell his Thorney and Tavistock estates to the tenants on terms so favourable that many of his Thorney farms were reported to have been resold within a year at vastly increased prices. So the countryside starts to shift a little as tenants become owner-occupiers, paying mortgages to the bank rather than rent to their lord. And the great families of the British countryside start to leave the great houses. At the present time, hundreds of country houses, once centres of an active social life, are in the market for disposal, whilst others have been acquired for sanatoria, schools, religious houses, asylums and similar purposes. And the National Trust exists at this time and snaps a lot of them up. But the aristocrats who wanted to stay on the land dealt with death duties by moaning about them. Lord Lymington, who will become a main character on this channel, said that death duties were responsible for forcing the aristocracy into cities and stripping England of the ruling class. It was a pernicious system since it drove the landowner to business instead of caring personally for his land, and so deprived the country of independent leadership. And the aristocrats who were interested in personal, active, masculine leadership, as represented in fox hunting, were more than happy to fight in the First World War, which exacerbated this. The war came. It meant that the land had to be exploited, sometimes under the direction of ignorant shirkers from Whitehall to feed the people. In many instances, those who owned the land were killed, their heirs paid death duties, and thus helped on the ruin of the countryside for which they had fought. Partly to pay death duties, 1/3 of the land changed hands during the war, mostly to tenants. With death duties, being an aristocrat in the traditional sense, as somebody who lived in a big house and didn't work, became economically unviable. Death duties and other taxes have rendered the landowner's position almost untenable except by expenditure of income from outside. But Lymington thought that this was really dangerous because if the ruling class was undermined, Britain would be doomed to bad government. He said death duties are the enemy of continuity and personal responsibility. It is a far greater quality to be able to administer wealth with the burden of responsibility fully shouldered than to acquire it, generally at the expense of others. The logical meaning of death duties is that no one should possess wealth unless he has personally acquired it. So here we have a man arguing that he deserves not to be taxed because he has the burden of spending all of the money that he's been given for free, which is beyond satire, but you get the picture, they're really upset about it. The First World War will get its own episode, but in essence the government doesn't really interfere with farming until 1917 because they don't want to step on the toes of any freedom-loving Englishmen, and the food supply doesn't seem that precarious. But in 1915 a government commission headed by Lloyd George's mate Lord Milner, and including scientists like Daniel Hall, unanimously concluded that the only method of effecting a substantial increase in the gross production of food in England and Wales for the harvest of 1916 and later consists in restoring to arable cultivation some of the poorer grassland that has been laid down since the 1870s. So they want to reverse the agricultural decline with a ploughing campaign. When Lloyd George became Prime Minister in 1916, he started acting on the reports of the committee and started promoting the leadership of scientists in agriculture. The important scientists are Daniel Hall of the Rothamsted Research Station, who was appointed the de facto secretary to the Ministry of Agriculture in 1917. C.S. Orwin, who is a professor of agriculture at Oxford, and George Stapledon, who breeds plants. These guys are very important over the next few decades. On the 1st of February 1917, German submarines started attacking merchant shipping, which threatened our food supply. So Lloyd George appoints his friend Sir Arthur Lee to be Director General of a new food production department. The government wanted farmers to produce more food, but that meant protecting them from aristocratic interference. In the words of Daniel Hall, in 1917, a Corn Production Act was passed, which introduced 3 basic but complementary principles: a guaranteed minimum price for wheat and oats, a minimum rate of wage for agricultural labourers, while increases in rent in response to the guaranteed prices were forbidden. These measures helped agricultural labourers and farmers, but not landlords. The guidance of the scientists rather than the paternalism of the aristocracy was promoted as the fundamental principle for good agriculture. Daniel Hall was able to get state support for his research station, and in 1919 the Welsh plant breeding station was founded under George Stapledon. Incidentally, Arthur Lee shared Lloyd George's view that the aristocratic domination of the countryside in politics was archaic, and he brought a country house called Chequers, which he subsequently donated to the nation. The idea was that this country house would be for prime ministers, as the post-war generation of politicians were not to be aristocrats, so they wouldn't have their own house with which to entertain important visitors. It's still used for this today, although Rishi Sunak does have his own mansion. In 1920, the Corn Production Act was replaced by an Agriculture Act, which retained all of the helpful measures for labourers and farmers, but aristocrats could be stripped of their estates if they managed them badly, to such an extent as to prejudice materially the production of food thereon, or the welfare of those who are engaged in the cultivation of the estate. Evicted tenants were entitled to a year's rent in compensation, and committees were established to set a minimum wage, and guaranteed prices were maintained. The government seemed to be finally dragging the countryside out of the depression that had gripped it since the 1870s. But then, in 1921, and before the government had to give anybody any money, this act was repealed, and the countryside once again plummeted into poverty. Lord Lymington called this the Great Betrayal, and Stapledon called it a shattering blow. Within a year, the price of wheat had fallen by 48%, and within 18 months, wages had fallen by 40%. So this sets the scene for the run-up to the Second World War. The countryside is thrown back into decline, and everybody suffers. Farm labourers are poor, farmers are poor, and this causes something of a brain drain, as they can buy cheap land in Canada, New Zealand, America, Australia, Argentina, wherever else, so a lot of them just leave. Aristocrats are very upset about death duties, and they feel that their traditional role as leaders of the countryside is being undermined, and the agricultural scientist is rising in prominence and displacing the traditional advice of the landlord. Orwin and Hall actually blame landlords for the rot in the countryside and campaigned to have all British land nationalised to fix it, which is actually quite radical. Unsurprisingly, this really upsets Lord Lymington and his friends, so they deal with it by inventing their own brand of fascism and trying to overthrow the government, which nobody ever talks about. They want to eradicate farmers and silence their scientific leaders by relegating everybody back to being a peasant. Because only if you have obedient peasantries can the aristocracy fulfil their traditional role as social and political leaders of the country. Lloyd George's death duties get most of the blame for the aristocratic decline between the wars, so in many ways mark the start of a debate about land use in Britain that continues to this day, and the aristocrats don't lose sight of this. In 1957, Wentworth Day wrote of the embittered little man from Wales. Little more than half a century later, the dead hand of death duties has struck root and branch at the whole centuries-old, once inviolate structure of British land ownership, country life, and, by a queer twist, at wildlife itself. This is an interesting quote, because you see that the anti-farmer, anti-scientist, aristocratic class interest, complaining about the taxes needed to fund the welfare state, morphs into environmentalism as we recognise today. But this isn't about climate change. So now we're going to take a very deep dive into what the scientists have to say, what the aristocrats have to say, and what the farmers are doing while all that's going on. I'll see you in the next one.